Good evening, everyone. My name is Zoe Isabella Taylor. I am a senior from Wellesley College studying art history and cinema and media studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Davis Museum's virtual presentation by historian Philip J. DeLoria, organized in conjunction with the exhibition Lisa Rayana in Pursuit of Venus Infected, on view through December 18th. Please know that the Davis will close on December 19th for renovations and will reopen in February 2024 with the career survey of Wellesley alumna artist Lorraine O'Grady, class of 1955, for the show Lorraine O'Grady's Both And. I hope you will visit this fall. Oops. Sorry about that. And next with that, we will begin with a native land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Davis Museum at Wellesley College is built on an ancestral and traditional land of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize that the United States removal, termination, and assimilation policies and practices resulted in the forced settlement of Indigenous lands and the attempted erasure of Indigenous cultures and languages. We further acknowledge the oppression, injustices, and discrimination that Indigenous people have endured, and that there is much work to be done on the important journey to reconciliation. We commit to strengthen our understanding of the history and contemporary lives of Indigenous peoples and to steward this land. We further recognize that many Indigenous people living here today, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc nations, who have rich ancestral histories in Wellesley and its surrounding communities. Today, their descendants remind us that they are still here, where they maintain a vital and visible presence. We honor and respect the enduring relationship between these peoples and this land, as well as the strength of Indigenous culture and knowledge, the continued existence of tribal sovereignty, and the principle of tribal self-determination. And just some information on how to participate in today's program, with this being a Zoom webinar format. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days. We are using a webinar format, and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, however, you can use the Q&A box to enter your questions. Live captioning is provided through our Zoom webinar. You can turn it on and off with the closed captions button in the features bar at the bottom of your screen. Now, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Lisa Fishman, Ruth Gordon Shapiro, class of 1937, director of the Davis Museum, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks to Zoe Taylor for so ably introducing our event this evening, and to Ryan Rowe for supporting the chat and Q&A, and to media specialist at the Davis, Serena Khan-Reddy, for her work at the back end in organizing this webinar. Let me also reiterate a warm invitation to visit this fall. Maori artist Lisa Rayana's visually stunning and conceptually provocative digital panorama, In Pursuit of Venus Infected, is based on a fashionable early 19th century French scenic wallpaper, Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique, that capitalized on popular fascination with the voyages of Captain James Cook and other European explorers to the South Pacific. Rayana destabilizes the dominant historical narrative of encounter, centering Indigenous people as agents rather than subjects, privileging Native realities, experiences, and points of view. The critique embedded in the work is political, aesthetic, technological, and historical, rendered through a decolonial lens. The exhibition and related programming, including this webinar, are generously supported by the Mildred Cooper Glimpsher Class of 61 Endowed Fund, the Davis World Cultures Fund, the Davis Museum Endowed Fund for International Cultural Programs, and Wellesley College Friends of Art. This evening's program with Philip J. DeLoria expands our understanding of Indigenous making with a focus on Dakota artist Mary Sully. Philip J. DeLoria is professor of history at Harvard University and the author of Indians in Unexpected Places and Playing Indian, His most recent book, co-authored with Alexander I. Olson, is American Studies, A User's Guide. He is a trustee of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, where he chairs the Repatriation Committee, a former president of the American Studies Association, and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Join me in welcoming Phil DeLoria.
Well, thank you all so much. Lisa, thanks for the generous introduction. Zoe, thank you for doing our land acknowledgement and getting things going. Ryan, thank you for sort of manning the, the chat. And Serena, thank you for all the technical things. Thanks to the Davis Museum. Thanks to Wellesley College. I'm honored to be here. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in, for this virtual program. So I'm going to start right in, and I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. This being a talk about art, I've actually got a lot of art and a lot of images to show. And so here I go. And I hope you're all just getting the kind of title card there. I want to begin and end actually the talk with a particular specific kind of image, and I'll just leave it up here for a moment. If we're paying close attention to this, first thing you'll notice is the work is comprised of 3 distinct panels. The top panel segmented into 4 horizontal sections, strong verticals crossing those 2 bottom sections, bilateral symmetry defining the whole. The subtitle, Pre-Columbian Freedom, etc., seems to capture a progression of social and political change over time, visible when you trace the panel, this top panel, from the bottom to the top, right? Pre-Columbian freedom, reservation fetters, the uncertain future. A middle panel then elaborates some of the iconic themes found in the top panel, and a bottom panel distills them into a simplified pattern. It's a little bit of a riot of color and image, maybe even something of a mess. So the question that I want to begin with is, how might we make sense of this curious piece? How might we read it? How should we understand the artist, her moment, and her aesthetic agenda? So the artist who produced these works was Mary Sully, called herself that. She was interested in the decoding and expression of a sensibility that was particularly American and particularly American Indian. Between the late 1920s and the early 1940s, Sully created a series of what she called personality prints. They weren't actually prints, but that's what she called them. These were images that sought to capture the personalities of various individuals and concepts that were central to her moment. Now, there are a number of ways to tell Mary Sully's story, and I want to begin by exploring a few possibilities as a way of kind of deepening her biography before we dive into the art itself. Mary Sully, so we'll begin with I think, an evocative genealogy. Mary Sully came from an artistic family. Her mother, Mary Sully Bordeaux, was the daughter of General Alfred Sully, military man with an artistic bent. His father, that is Mary Sully's great-grandfather, you might even call mildly illustrious. He was the prominent early 19th century portraitist Thomas Sully, who studied with Gilbert Stuart and Benjamin West and painted elites, including John Quincy Adams, Lafayette, Thomas Jefferson, and Queen Victoria. You have almost certainly seen his work. For Sully's portrait of Andrew Jackson is the basis for the engraving on the $20 bill, at least for the moment. So here we have 2 portraitists, 3 artists linked together across only a few generations. I find this interesting, suggestive, evocative, full of possibility. Alas, Sully never had contact with her grandfather and was raised in the cradle with her maternal grandfather, that is, raised in the cradle of her father's family. So there's really no direct or discernible connection between her idiosyncratic portraiture and the work of her great-grandfather, other than that they were both portraitists. So maybe we start again. This time with a historical picture of her aesthetic life. Living from 1896 to 1963, the Dakota Sioux artist Mary Sully worked during key transitional moments in American Indian art history. These were moments when American Indian representational and material culture practices became engaged in a sustained and self-conscious encounter with the world of Western art and aesthetics. They were moments that witnessed the development of marketplaces for Native art and interventions in those markets by the state and by private brokers. And there were moments that produced the first institutionalized practices, for Indian people at least, of artistic training, technique, and theory in the Western mode. What you can see on the slide are three specific kinds of examples that unfolded over a relatively short period of time in the early 20th century in three different places. So this is where the new Indian arts come from. She participated in none of this, almost completely anonymous in her own time, isolated from any of these formative traditions of the new American Indian arts. Sully laid no claim to recognition either then or now. And why would we have heard of her? Sully's art is not to be found in a museum or gallery. Only a few of her images have ever been published as utterly pedestrian illustrations in an obscure book written by her sister. Her major output, this series of 134 of these personality prints, is held privately. During her lifetime, she had only a handful of formal showings of the work, and these took place in remote Indian schools, venues so far removed from the art world that they had absolutely no impact there whatsoever, generating only these perfunctory testimonials from school principals. If you were feeling kind of mean, you might suggest that Sully was kind of a motivated doodler, a neighborhood artist with no possibility of finding an audience outside the supportive family and friends that convince the mediocre that they are in fact talented. So Mary Sully in this sense is, alas, perilously close to falling outside of history altogether. Well, perhaps it will be more useful to think of her biographically, to offer a chronological story attuned to her inner life. Perhaps Sully turned to art to compensate for other inadequacies or challenges. Though she had a strong education at the All Saints Episcopal School for Girls in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, she proved a mediocre student and did not survive despite the constant support of her sister at the University of Kansas. She then set out to study art in Chicago, but ill health kept her from attending class and she quickly dropped out. At one point, she tried to open a candy and ice cream store. Its failure put her sister into debt. Sully kept to herself, did not marry, and was barely and only intermittently employed, and in fact, relied almost completely upon her long-suffering sister to keep her in-house and home. Indeed, Sully was so deeply and chronically shy that she was considered by some who knew her to be somewhat mentally or sort of psychologically impaired. In 1925, she had a breakdown, followed by a psychiatric evaluation and a short course of treatment. My colleagues in psychology, who I've described her symptoms to, are reluctant to diagnose a non-patient with a sketchy 8-decade-old set of symptoms, but they have been willing to suggest a few possibilities, things like bipolar disorder, reactive depression, panic attacks. Although Sully repeatedly drove her sister across the country, she was the driver and mechanic for the two of them, and she was able to navigate New York, Detroit, and other cities. She grew more and more withdrawn over the course of her life, at times unwilling to leave her bedroom, particularly if visitors were present in the house. And so her life can remind one in bare outline of someone like, say, Emily Dickinson. And so Mary Sully, a classic 20th century modernist genius, far ahead of the times, so far ahead of the times that she was shunned by contemporaries, working alone in isolation, perhaps a little bit crazy. You may be wondering why I think Mary Sully is worth our time, and you may be wondering if I will ever let you see her work. The answer is soon, but I hope you can appreciate my rhetorical strategy here. I think sort of laying out her liabilities, in some ways, I hope you'll agree, will strengthen the case for her when you actually look at her art, which is quite stunning and amazing. So let me start over one more time, this time with a bit of personal narrative that might help situate my own interest in her. I've been working sporadically for many years on a family history project dealing with my grandparents, Vine DeLoria Sr. and Barbara DeLoria, and Vine's sister Senior Ella DeLoria, who worked for the anthropologist Franz Boas at Columbia University, and who authored the important ethnographic novel Water Lily. One of the shadow presences in this project has been the other sister, Susan Mabel, or Susie DeLoria, Ella's constant companion. When I was much younger, my parents had in the basement a large gray box of odd drawings. And at one point I pulled out 3 of my favorites and carried them around for a little too long, I suspect. The rest I remembered only indistinctly. And then one year following a family move or a reorganization, they were gone. for decades. We all came to assume that they'd been lost or perhaps destroyed in the devastating house fire my parents suffered in 1994. In 2006, however, my mother pulled out an old suitcase stuffed under the basement stairwell, and there they were, 134 personality prints created by Susie DeLoria, aka Mary Sully, my great aunt. And so a different genealogy. Susie was the sister of Ella DeLoria and Vine DeLoria Sr., who were two prominent 20th century Dakota Sioux intellectual leaders. Her father was Philip J. DeLoria, one of the first Dakota converts to Christianity to be ordained a minister. He was a leader in the Episcopal Church for 30 years at the turn of the 20th century, was my great-grandfather. Philip J. DeLoria was the son of Sasue, or Francois DeLoria, a prominent Yankton, Dakota medicine man. And Sasue was the second generation descendant of a French trader and a Yankton woman. Susie DeLoria's mother was Mary Sully, a Kichitawin, soldier woman, as they called her, who was the daughter of Alfred Sully, and Susan Pehandutuwin is what they called Winter Girl in the winter of 1857-58. And so the DeLorias were mixed bloods, descendants of two families. Here's a slightly more complicated genealogy. Descendants of two families, not one, but two families with histories of cross-cultural traffic. Well, these double histories were played out in her formative years. Raised on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in South Dakota, her upbringing was defined by the Indian Episcopal Church, which served as a repository for Sioux cultural, and I would argue political, nationalism. At Standing Rock, she sang from a Dakota language hymnal, read from a Dakota language Bible, heard sermons in the Dakota language. Under my great-grandfather's leadership, it was truly an Indian church. And yet, at the mission school nearby, she and Ella both learned English well, and indeed Latin. Ella would come back to the school to teach Latin. So Mary Sully's world was interesting, or it was complicated, multiple, a little blurry, right, and quite compelling, I think. Most importantly, Mary Sully was not a doodler. She had a coherent aesthetic project, one that sought to navigate and express this complicated subjectivity born out of this mixed cultural upbringing. She imagined for herself a professional identity, and she probably sought to locate herself as an artist through the use of her grandfather's surname, Sully, which had some small traction in the world of American art. She saw herself as well as an industrial designer, a maker of patterns for wallpapers, linoleum, tile, and carpets. She knew what she wanted her art to convey, and I would argue she turned a uniquely creative eye on her time and place. And so the personality prints are 3-panel works with each triptych representing or trying to represent the essence of the personality in question. They're meant to be hung vertically like this, with a title card attached to the bottom image. Sully used what I think is likely remnant low-grade art paper, colored pencils, a ruler, and a compass. The images are highly symmetrical, either sort of bilateral symmetry up and down, or rotational symmetry based on the sort of circular sort of form. Most of them seem to have been drawn during the 1930s. It's difficult to date them with much more precision than that. For many of her personalities, Sully drew heavily upon popular culture. So there are prints for Eddie Cantor, Greta Garbo, Mae West, Marian Anderson, Fred Astaire, Lupe Velez, Henry Ford, Shirley Temple, Sonia Henry, Dizzy Dean, and Babe Ruth, and a host of others, many of whom have dropped from our memories of the era. Lawrence Tibbett is a great example of one of these people who is quite well known in his day, but is not really part of our sort of canon, at the moment. And I love this image so much. I think it's one of the most beautiful ones in the collection. Lawrence Tibbett had a little cabin in California at a place called Temescal Canyon, and there was a little amphitheater there. And this is what happens with these images, is the more historical research you do and you understand things about the people, the images themselves take on a kind of a life. I always saw this thing as being a kind of humanoid trilobite in some weird way. And there's obviously musical notes, and he's a singer, and I got that. But I was really struck by this piece of the image. And I didn't really think until I learned sort of about what Tibbett would do. He would walk out onto the stage of this amphitheater at the bottom of this canyon, and he would sing, and the notes would echo out of the canyon. And suddenly I realized this is not a foreground figure, this is a background, and this is sort of empty space figure of a canyon itself. And here are the sedimentary walls of the canyon, and here are the notes echoing out of the canyon and spreading. And then interestingly, in the second panel, she sort of takes this image, here's the ocean looking out at the Pacific and the sky, and she turns it upside down as if she's looking through a camera obscura, and then repeats the pattern and makes it into notes. I mean, so I hope you can sort of see what I see when I look at these images, which is a kind of an amazing vision, a kind of creative genius sort of vision. So a second group of works drew from her deep heritage in the Episcopal Church and includes figures like Bishop William Hobart Hare, Bishop Peter Trimble Rowe, the orator Phillips Brooks, and events like Easter, church organ, and a gloomy dean. And a third and smaller category reflects ideas or concepts: greed, children of divorce, husbands in the USA, leap year, gossip, spring, and even highway rudeness. Sometime in the late 1930s, I think perhaps 1938, Sully generated a list of 105 existing images. There are currently 134 surviving prints, so that one can separate out a list of 29 images produced in the later 1930s or early 1940s. And among these are two works, explicitly themed Indian works, the Indian Church and Indian History, to which I will return. So in most, but not all cases, the first of the three panels, and I should say I've sort of rearranged these on the screen, I forgot to mention this, to just simply to get more image into the screen. So in this instance, the top left is always the top panel, the top right is always the middle panel, and this bottom panel is still the bottom. So the first of the three panels gestures either to the symbolic or the representational, or perhaps both. In this case, the baseball hurled by St. Louis Cardinals pitcher Dizzy Dean. Dean was a national celebrity in the 1930s, the leader of the so-called Gas House Gang, which won the World Series in 1934, a year that seems oddly important to this project. He was an all-star in 34, 35, 36, 37, exemplified a kind of gritty, hustling populism that proved evocative during the Great Depression. So in the top panel, Sully introduces the form, color, and pattern that will make up the key thematic interests of the middle panel. Often, Sully used these elements, color in particular, to capture abstract and intangible things, the blur of color, motion, the stitching of a thrown ball, or perhaps even the dizziness that supposedly characterized Dean. So you can see this kind of dizzy, sort of baseballish kind of thing on a diamond. What's really interesting to me is why this colored lifesaver, here. But if you think about the ways in which these forms connect to these forms, and you let your eye play, you can see that it's actually a formation of an optical illusion in which the baseball seems to come out of the colored disc, which you imagine to be the sort of power of Dean throwing the ball. The baseball seems to kind of move towards you. So these elements will usually, though not always, be transformed in the middle panel into a precisely drawn geometrical design pattern. In this case, a kind of colored vortex amidst the brown diamonds. I kind of like to think that she invented the Apple spinning wheel of death here. So these first two panels are always on larger paper, pretty consistent, about 14 by 24 inches, while the bottom panel almost always drawn on 12 by 14 inch paper, and so is always smaller. It's often a simplified and distilled version of the second panel's geometric pattern, frequently evoking a native or Indian kind of beadwork or weaving pattern. These bottom panels, though, are not sort of direct kind of native patterns, at least not often. They're more artistic interpretations of American Indian designs, more than functional patterns, reworkings of established styles from the Great Plains, from the woodlands, sometimes even from the Southwest. Well, there are certain common elements, I think, that allow us to think more about Sully's aesthetic and how it took shape. The images, as I've said, were not simply elaborate doodles, but fully conceived works that required a fair bit of sketching and pre-planning. In a number of cases, the backside of the paper shows the marks of these first efforts, things that were mismeasured, unsatisfactory, or for other reasons, discarded. Sully's symmetry often took as its starting point the center of the paper, as you can see here, with circular structures radiating outward to the point where they could be converted to angular lines and squared off lattice work. So celebrity was really quite central to her interests. I think it was there that she found a sort of notion of essential personality, these personality prints, defined in part through the distinctive practices that made individuals into celebrities, fetishes designed for mass cultural consumption. Here you can see Lunt and Fontaine, Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontaine, two kind of theatrical performers, sort of the stair steps, sort of noting their rise to stardom, their own kind of starness together, but they're the union of their marriage. And yet Lunt was actually gay, and the marriage was considered a lavender marriage. And so Mary Sully is clearly aware of the questions about sexuality that are sort of lingering here, and uses the colors purple and lavender, right, to actually construct a picture, a portrait of this particular kind of couple. So she was immersed in the moment that the cultural historian Warren Sussman famously described in terms of a shift from what he called a culture of character to a culture of personality. She didn't worry for a minute about the transient nature of the celebrities that she was celebrating. For us as viewers, some 80-some years later, that transience is on full display. I might ask, if we were together in person, how many of you remember Jesse Crawford? And I'm betting that not many of you would be raising your hands right now. Well, in the 1920s, Jesse Crawford was America's most famous organist, playing the backdrop for silent films. In the 1930s, with the advent of sound pictures, Crawford turned to recording and performing, playing the country's best-known multi-rank organs. They called him the poet of the organ. And so here you can see in the first panel, top panel here on the left, the organ has been converted into an abstract but still referential image. From the center, one can see 3 ranks of organ keyboard wrapped into circles with 8 large bars representing foot pedals. Around the edges are ranks of organ pipes, each using color to represent sound and timbre. In the second panel, the organ pattern is simplified and made into a kind of decorative lattice work that sometimes actually these sorts of things cover organ pipes. The color begins to take over the image, right, in this second panel, a process that will come to fruition in the third panel, which is rich with color. And here the iconography attached to that central organ will transform into an image resembling a kind of a compass with arrows leading out towards a kind of Indian pattern, sort of, except not really. It really looks a bit more like an Art Deco kind of pattern, and it points to the complications of this. It also points, I think, to the relations that she has between sound and color. So I want to pause here then and return to the story of Mary Sully's psychological challenges: bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorder. Images like this one might lead us to tell the story with a somewhat different diagnosis, that of synesthesia, the crossing of brain connections between various perceptual functions, such that one might look at numbers or hear music and find that one was also seeing colors. Again, one treads lightly into the world of diagnosis, but I'm struck by the ways that Sully's own personality, as well as we can know it, resonates with this. I'm going to read a kind of composite description of a synesthete offered by the psychologist Richard Sedgwick, who's sort of been the kind of person who's studied synesthesia the most. I read this to my mom and she was like, yes, check, check, check. With the exception of this first character, a left-handed female, she was right-handed, who feels alienated, has a cosmic and comprehensive worldview, a feeling of self-importance, or a sense that something quite special will happen to her at any moment. She is shy, sensitive, runs the emotional gamut from the highest highs to the lowest lows on a constant basis. She is artistic and creative and has a propensity to engage in the visual arts, often later in life. She's highly intelligent and intuitive, but conveys an abstruseness that causes others to perceive her as dense and difficult to understand. This was my mother's reading of Susie, or Mary Sully, and she actually knew her. She's embarrassed and confused by her condition, will not reveal it to many people. To lose her synesthesia, however, would be catastrophic, denying her a most rich and enjoyable way of seeing the world. And just to show you one final one additional music thing, this one I think is also quite lovely. Mildred Dilling, the harpist, and you can see the ways in which fingers and color in the top panel have sort of taken shape around the harp, strings of the harp. In the second, you get that kind of glissando kind of feeling of a harp, moving around. And then you get this very curious thing that doesn't really look very native at all. And that might lead us to ask some questions about the visual vocabularies that she brought to this project. So we might ask, how did Mary Sully see the world? She may have heard music and seen color, or she may have looked at objects and seen numbers, patterns, and symmetries. But I think it's safe to say she also saw the world as a set of cultural possibilities, and she looked at these with a penetrating eye. So one useful way to move more deeply into her work is to consider more explicitly what she may have seen and or what we may think we see when we look at these images. So here are a few of the possible visual images we might extract from this work. And what I've done here is sort of tried to sort of match some visual possibilities with one of the panels from the work. So this is from a marvelous little image of Cornelia Otis Skinner. So par fleche, these decorative painting traditions, the Great Plains, particularly this color pattern and these geometrical patterns found on storage boxes and trunks. The somewhat different patterns born of different technical challenges found in quill work and beadwork. Quilting traditions, particularly these diamond shapes, key not only to the native star quilt, but to many quilting patterns. She was deeply engaged with her sister, Ella, in ethnographic kinds of work. And here you can see Lenton Fontaine again, those two boxes at the bottom, par fleche boxes. On the right, this was an ethnographic illustration she did for her sister. Here's another wonderful example. On the right, two images from the personality prints. On the left, two nearly identical images from the ethnographic drawings that she did. She was also, because she was growing up at Standing Rock, heir to a really interesting move that a couple of Native women made there, Nellie Two Bear Gates and Edith Claymore. In the Plains tradition, these pictographic kinds of images would be more the domain of men, whereas the abstract geometries that we've been seeing would be the domain of women. And yet these two women at the turn of the 20th century began sort of taking that male pictographic tradition and doing this amazing and beautiful and intensive beadwork on purses and valises and things like that. So she was there at Standing Rock at the moment, right, where beading and representation were actually being changed around by Native women. So we've got these Native or Indigenous kinds of influences, which I think are quite palpable in the work. At the same time, we might also point to a much broader set of possibilities, including tile, stained glass, familiar to her through her church background. Given her taste for personalities from the film world, even such things as the human spirals and circles found in the Busby Berkeley musicals of the 1930s. She was working during some of the high moments of Art Deco. So I imagine her seeing wall paintings, borders, other decorative ornaments. Some of the panels, particularly second and third panels, have a distinct Deco sensibility, reflecting what some have called the zigzag modern aspects of Deco. At the same time, many of the panels also harken back to the earlier sensibilities of arts and crafts. Many people look at this and see the kaleidoscope, a popular toy, useful visual reference for those rotational symmetries in the center of the paper. The bilateral symmetry of the pieces leads some viewers to think of the ambiguous images used by Hermann Rorschach to test for personality and emotional function. Rorschach published his test in 1921, but it was interestingly only part of a larger world of therapy that used ink blots as indexes to creativity, and a minor but quite interesting world of what was called klexography, the art of ink blot picture making. In one case that I'll talk a little bit about later, her first panels lean toward the kind of abstraction found in murals by figures such as Aaron Douglas and Diego Rivera. And of course, this is the moment in the late 20s and 30s when the sort of comic strip really comes into its own, and you can see these kinds of influence as well. And she had a popular model for the entire project, one could argue, in Time magazine, which began publishing in 1923 and featured on its weekly cover the portrait of a significant personality. And you can see that 28 of these total images feature individuals appearing on the cover and many individuals who appeared within the pages. At the same time, though, a number of modernist artists were experimenting with the possibilities of abstract, what they called abstract or emblematic portraiture, including a set of poster portraits crafted by Charles Demuth between 1923 and 1929. You can see one of Demuth's portraits here on the right. His most famous image, probably, I saw the figure 5 in gold, which is a poster portrait of William Carlos Williams. Curiously, the two of them actually did portraits, sort of abstract portraits for two of the same people. Here's Gertrude Stein. They both also did one for Eugene O'Neill. And you can see the differences between Demuth's, Stein and Mary Sully's, where she's riffing on Stein's "a rose is a rose is a rose." She also had a model for thinking about a career as an American Indian artist. In December of 1931, the Exposition of Tribal Arts held a kind of coming out party exhibit at the Grand Central Station Galleries in New York City, featuring some 600 works. Now, from February to June 1928, spring 1931 to spring 1932, and periodically throughout the 1930s, these two sisters, Ella and Susie DeLoria, lived in New York City or New Jersey, while Ella worked on Dakota language and ethnography at Columbia University with Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict. Sully and her sister were likely to have seen exhibitions of modernist art, and she may have integrated ideas and concepts into her own representations. And it's equally possible, if not likely, that they saw the marketing and display of work by Indian artists as well. So I'm going to walk through just a couple of images in slightly more detail and do a few more of these kind of close readings. In the Sir Malcolm Campbell triptych, one can see elements of some of these visual traditions that we just talked about. For contemporary viewers, the image can be mystifying. In the center of the piece, of the top image, the top panel, sits a blue stylized duck-like bird with wings, bright yellow beak, green eyes, and what looks to be 4 wheels. 2 large open brown ovals lead to both edges of the image, here, while other large brown ovals sit above and below. Dreamlike, a set of 24 colored ovals dance in the empty spaces, while 7 sets of oddly connected circles, these things, fill in the remainder of the gaps. So it's reasonable for us to deduce that the image represents a bird on wheels sitting at the crossing of 2 roads. But how to make sense of this is not wholly clear. The audience that Sully imagined for herself, however, would have known Malcolm Campbell as someone who set land speed records in a series of super cool looking cars, all named the Bluebird. He also did this with boats as well. And with that knowledge, one can now read abstractions as representational signs. The Bluebird drives on brown oval speed tracks. Sir Malcolm's distinctive driving goggles are suggested in the connected circular forms, the colored ovals meant to evoke his dreams of speed. In the second panel, the brown racetrack ovals emerge as the most significant visual element, winding speed together in a kind of, Celtic electron sort of pattern. And in the final panel, the ovals are brought together in a harmonious whole, evocative of deco or stained glass, and framing a highly abstract bluebird with the southwestern inflected Thunderbird-esque spread of its wings, and yet still holding on to the 4 wheels. While in many of the images, the elements disappear from one panel to the next in this series, the Dr. Defoe series, to my mind, one of the most beautiful in the set, each icon exists simultaneously in all 3 panels. They're laid out quite clearly in the top panel. Moon, cloud, halo, house, tree, umbrella, plant, flower, cat, and then are transformed but held constant in the other 2 panels. And once again, the personality is essential to understanding the iconography. In May 1934, Dr. Alan Roy Defoe was called to a Canadian farmhouse to help deliver the Dion quintuplets, the first set of quints to survive past infancy. But Defoe did not win fame simply for the delivery. He was awarded joint guardianship of the children, and he built this curious place, the Defoe Hospital and Nursery. Crowds could come to watch through mesh screens as these little girls played. The observation gallery in the house became part of Quintland, the surrounding infrastructure dedicated to selling quintuplet merchandise. This actually displaced Niagara Falls as one of the top tourist lures in Canada in the 1930s. And so here we have it, sheltering umbrellas, trees, and houses. Note the distinctive roof lines of those houses that actually echo Quintland. Growing plants, cats, and flowers, all in sets of 5. My own potted history of Defoe carries a bit of horror, At the seizure and the marketing of the quints, he turned them into film stars as well, or tried his best to do so. But Mary Sully's interest seems different, I think, intrigued and, if anything, celebratory. All these themes are held consistent in the second image. My friends tell me doing this kind of 5-point symmetry on a circle is an interesting mathematical challenge, and you can see, I think, how well she's risen to that particular challenge. In the third panel, one can see a fusion of design elements. The outer edge suggests a southwestern American Indian blanket design in the stair-step pattern assigned to those clouds, while the inner rectangle still has a kind of deco stained glass kind of look. So I'm going to pretend to be an art historian here. Let us step back and make up cool sounding, but maybe also useful categories to describe these panels. Call the top panels the symbolic pictorial for the ways in which they sort of offer representational pictures, but also symbols and abstractions. Call the middle ones the geometric abstract for their focus on geometry. And let's call the bottom one for the moment the culturally overdetermined, the complicated ones. So how should we think then about the relationship existing between them? Well, to do this, and one of the arguments I make in the book is that we might start with two axes. What I think of as a transformational axis about change and a simultaneous one. By transformation, I want to suggest the ways that the vertical hanging establishes the three panels in a sequential and thus developmental relation to one another. So how does the first panel become the second panel, then become the third panel, right? How are they transformed? Or we might ask, does the sequence run in reverse from bottom to top? Should the sequence be thought of in spatial terms, perhaps as a development of scale, right? Or should we see them temporally as encapsulations of narratives? Do they reflect, for example, a story of social and cultural evolution, of personal development, of the modern and its antecedents? Can we even legitimately convert the words top, middle, and bottom into first, second, and third? And if so, how? And I'll want to bracket this, and I'll return to this question in a moment. Because at the same time the hanging asks your eye to move from panel to panel, I think it also asks you to consider the images together, simultaneously and relationally. Each panel is so closely related to the others, and each reaching for similar forms of iconographic message and abstract design, that they can also be read in unified terms, as complex multiple renderings of the same visual vocabulary. Not so much a narrative then as a collection, kind of a bag of marbles, right? All kind of the same. So when viewed simultaneously in this way, as a collection, each panel then remains part of a whole, comprised partly by modernist aesthetics, partly by a range of possibilities from vernacular visual cultures, partly by industrial and other design elements, and partly by American Indian visual vocabularies. And that cultural mashup, complications and confusions, one might argue, stands as a particularly evocative representation of the multiple and confusing possibilities for American Indian people and their cultural expression during the 1930s, the decade when things fell apart for American Indian cultural brokers like Ella DeLoria. In the earlier period, in the teens and the 20s, significant numbers of Indian people had lived cosmopolitan, often urban lives under the shelter of a kind of modernist primitivist desire. Ella and her sister had lived reasonably well in this moment. In addition to work with the YWCA and a teaching job at the Haskell Indian School, Ella earned side money as an Indian princess. Here's both of them as Indian princesses, giving lectures, leading campfire groups, teaching Indian dances, selling craft goods. During the 1930s, however, that world of cross-racial, modern, anti-modern wage labor performance began to fragment, and Ella's audiences began to shrink even as she herself aged out of the princess role. In Mary Sully's one moment of public exposure, in an odd 1944 newsreel series entitled Unusual Professions, she framed herself, or was framed, not as a cosmopolitan artist, but as an Indian princess, the carrier of ancient primitive traditions. And I'll just play this little clip. It's only a minute or so long, and hopefully it's crazy. And anyone who knows its geography will understand the ways that Gallup, New Mexico is not the home of the ancestral home of the Sioux.
On the high mesa lands of New Mexico near Gallup is the oldest Indian village in the United States, carrying on the traditions of a prehistoric past. Corn is prepared as it was before the white man, with culture in one hand and a rifle in the other, began to civilize the Sioux. The home of Mary Sully, a full-blooded Sioux who taught the culture and now produces beauty based on an art that was old when Spain was new. Symbolic portraits, they are understood by the Indians, while their pattern may be admired by every eye. Each line and angle means something. Literally, she produces patterns or symbols which identify the subject. Helen Keller's spirit emerges here, and Walter Winchell peeks through this pattern. Bergen and McCarthy are in their best form, and Avril Berg looks like this to the Indian whose ancient art Mary Sully projects into the future, touched with the rainbow's arc of color.
So this is a moment when she actually had her hair cut short. You can see she's wearing a wig. So this kind of brand, this fading brand of authentic Indian performance was not enough to keep the sisters solvent during the Great Depression. And yet, perhaps the decline of this kind of primitivist performance aesthetic, right, which demanded them act in certain ways, also allowed Sully to imagine new opportunities for complex aesthetic engagements that move beyond primitivism, with its insistent demand for Indian authenticity and its rejection of cultural complications. This super interesting image of Helen Kane and Betty Boop, it took me quite a while to figure out that this top panel is actually a bathtub. This is a spigot. Bubbles are actually coming out. If you look through the Betty Boop canon, you see there's a lot of bathing and bubbling going on. So Ella made a successful pivot to ethnographic work in the early 1930s, but over time, Franz Boas moved her from salary work to contract work, and the sisters struggled. They were essentially homeless for long periods of time, bouncing from off-season tourist cabins to abandoned church rectories, to cheap motels and apartments, and even on one occasion living out of their car. Thus, we can see Sully's reuse of her materials, which were those of the vernacular and impoverished artists, paper and colored pencils. And we might think that her psychological struggles may have taken shape in terms of pressing and concrete social realities, suppressed anger, the anxieties surrounding the everyday oppressions of race, gender, and poverty. So one of the things at stake here is Sully's own location as a complicated, simultaneous, multi-origin subject. But another is the way in which the images add up together. They stand collectively as distillations of individual personalities that turn into revelations about a broader cultural terrain. Each image asks viewers to visualize Sully's own world of complication, and yet each precipitates more capacious social concepts and values. The fusion of adventure, speed, and technology that emerges from Malcolm Campbell, the dance between the plain brown of Dizzy Dean's populist labor and the magic of talent that accompanies his throne ball. And so it makes sense then that Sully would engage in more abstract cultural themes and values, things like road hogs and greed and children of divorce. So taken together, Sully's personalities also add up to a rich collective portrait of the American 1930s. And I wanted to make 2 or 3 more moves to kind of deepen this yet a bit more. We can go further into this moment. Ella DeLoria's closest anthropological collaborators at Columbia were Franz Boas, perhaps the foundational figure of early American anthropology, and for much of the 1930s, Ruth Benedict, one of the central figures in what was called culture and personality anthropology. Culture and personality emerged out of the interdisciplinary crossings between anthropology and psychology, sometimes sought to understand individuals in relation to cultures and to characterize whole cultures in relation to the development and upbringing of individuals. Culture and personality culminated with books by Benedict and Margaret Mead, who was herself a Benedict and Boas student, who would later assist Ella DeLoria with her own publications. Benedict's classic book, Patterns of Culture, came out in 1934. Ella must surely have read it and perhaps discussed it with her sister, and done so at the exact moment the latter was most engaged in her personality prints project. Indeed, if we date the first prints to the late 1920s, this print stylistically early can likely be dated to 1929. it begins to seem possible that the entire artistic project was developed in dialogue with Ella's explorations of linguistics, ethnography, and anthropology, which began in 1927. So the personality prints, then, one might argue, are themselves patterns of culture, a vernacular rendition of the formative practices of culture and personality anthropology. It also suggests the ways that these two sisters fed off one another intellectually. Well, there's a political story to go along with this intellectual history as well. To get there, I want to return back to that idea that we can read the images in a kind of a sequence, top to bottom or bottom to top. It is, of course, the great joy of art that all things are possible, and with these images, they certainly are. But which things are likely? So we imagine some possibilities. Bottom to top, with a bottom panel, often explicitly Indian, a bottom to top reading could suggest something like social evolution, an Indian primitive, evolving through stages into an advanced abstract modern. And there's a spatial hierarchy here as well, with the smaller Indian primitive at the bottom and the larger white, or at least non-Indian modern, on the top. But my eye, and I think the eyes of most people, does not flow so easily from low to high. I dart from the name tag at the bottom, I think, to the top image, which usually has bigger, blockier, more easily scanned shapes, often brighter colors and clearer lines. So I'll put a small stake in the ground and ask you to join me in emphasizing, at least for the moment, contingently, a top to bottom sequence. Moving developmentally from top to bottom would undo that progressive flow of low to high social evolution and a spatial hierarchy of modern and primitive. It would take one from symbolic or pictorial representation to pattern abstraction. And it takes you from the modern to what? To something beyond the modern. And what would that be? Even at their most Indian, the bottom panels demand recognition of a kind of modern abstract. If we follow the top to bottom sequence, the modern in the top, or the first panel, traces forward in time to a particularly Indian form of abstraction, one inflected by all manner of modernist visual vocabularies, but which also lays claim to something native. In aesthetic terms, this is the opposite of Indian primitivist art created for a white audience. It's an Indian abstract, right? And thus the title of this and the subtitle of the book, an Indian abstract in these bottom panels, a leading edge piece of modernism and modernity that was simultaneously Indian and which pointed to the future. This modern Indian abstract, I think, was art with political implications. Sosway, Mary Sully's grandfather, was a band headman. He had a hereditary chieftainship that passed down to his son, Philip Joseph DeLoria. Indeed, the son tried for several years to serve as both a political leader and an ordained Sioux Episcopalian minister. He entered the ministry at the behest of Sosway, who insisted that the political power of the old leadership could not be sustained in the face of American assaults, and that the new Indian leadership would have to mask itself within the forms of the Indian church, which is exactly what they did. So the visual pun in this first image, this first panel, suggests exactly that. The sheltering folded robes of the priest appear more readily to the eye as the exterior door of a teepee with these teepee flaps here, right? So it looks like a teepee, but in fact, it's this sheltering, this robe of the priest. So the church here is Indian. The teepee is the church, and it proved to be a key site for preserving and navigating Sioux culture and politics. In the book, I do quite a substantial reading of this image, and don't have time to do that now because I am trying to get us to a conclusion here. So the key site for preserving Sioux culture and politics until 1934. In that year, the same year as Patterns of Culture, the New Deal Congress passed what was called the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA, which gave tribes the option to vote to adopt tribal constitutions and limited self-government. And I'm not going to delve into the complications of the IRA here, which are many, but for better or worse, the IRA governments represented a significant step in the movement towards new institutional forms of political autonomy, which are visible today in tribal sovereignty. They rest not so much on charismatic leadership, as was the case with both older forms of governance and the church itself, but upon elections and representative government. In the 1930s, Indian people in the Dakotas were drawing upon memories of sovereignty and independence only a few decades past, and they were considering the limited sovereignty being offered through this IRA. Some were already demanding the nation-to-nation political relationships codified in treaties and backed up by Article 6 of the US Constitution. Now, Mary Sully did not see these claims developed as they would be in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But what she did see and experience was a critical moment of political transformation and new possibility that was active on the ground in South Dakota, reborn in struggle and despair during the 1930s. So this sense of political futurity linked to the memory of political past, I think maps with some precision onto the reading I've offered of an Indian abstract, of something complexly Indian that lay in some yet to be made future. The Indian abstract in those third panels dares us to imagine her imagining the possibilities for her people. All of which brings me back to Indian history. Like the Indian church, the Indian history triptych was likely part of her later work. It's impossible to offer anything other than the crude periodization I've already made, but Sully may have followed a pattern demonstrated by both her brother and sister and many other Native people, and that is a turning in later life from sort of adventurous cultural crossing to more explicit engagements with Indian subjectivity and identity. In the first panel here then, it is not social evolution that she's tracing, but colonial history, past, present, and future, and it's being traced sequentially from the bottom to the top. I am more than tempted, as you will no doubt recall, when contemplating this image to see more visible political imagery as well from the larger canon, evocations of Diego Rivera in the compartmentalized structure and Aaron Douglas in the silhouetted forms of modern anxiety and trauma. She had access to the work of both of these artists. So the internal chronology of the top panel then, right, bottom to top, runs counter to the temporal flow of the top to bottom reading pattern of the triptych as a whole, creating what I think is a deeply complicated sense of time, motion, and simultaneity, which shows up in the second panel. It's also just worth kind of noting the ways that there are three sort of formulations of time. And at the top is sort of like a dominant theme, which is to say a colonial stomping down on the aspirations of Indian people who are reaching for a future, pointing to a future, trying to sort of overcome those who have been fallen along the way. And instead we get this toxic sort of smoke, we get military, cowboy, corporate kinds of things, like literally crushing these dreams and aspirations. And the second panel then captures the unknowable complications of Indian history, demonstrates again her constant fascination with symmetry, order, and rhythm, but abandons all pretense of being a viable commercial design. In that sense, it's an aesthetic statement, right? Revels in complication and garish color. In panel 3, she makes a clear and coherent claim, I think, to a modern Indianness, one that is constantly aware and willing to speak of the barbed wire of history. Here she's flipped the entire panels on the side. You can see these are the feet. These are the brown figures of modernist anxiety. This is the barbed wire, but overriding the barbed wire is the color that goes with this representation of nativeness, of indigenousness. And if you'll remember those colors of the par flesh, these are the colors, right, of the par flesh. So it's this native kind of thing that's embedded within this. So I want to put one final twist on the story. Ella DeLoria at one point gestured to her own complex cultural location through a Dakota concept, the double woman, a figure that comes to women in dreams. Having had such a dream, a woman was gifted with exceptional skill in making things, such that none could excel her, as Ella wrote. They were expert at quill work, and they sometimes did the work of a man. At the same time, however, a double woman dreamer could be considered a little crazy, laughing uncontrollably and with a partner running around the camp circle bound together with a double, a partner connected with a rope from which was suspended the image of a baby. They were said to be promiscuous and to have many husbands. This was not the case with Ella and Susie DeLoria, who did not marry, were shaped by a dual set of conservative behavioral codes from both Dakota culture and the Episcopal Church. Ella referenced the double woman to think about how she had been outside her community, how she had taken on roles better suited to men, ethnographer, for example, and how she had produced a body of creative work. But really, it was Ella's sister, Susie, aka Mary Sully, who was perhaps the more touched, a woman who doubled her name and identity, who engaged in the modern version of quill work and creative skill, who was always at the social margins. For a double woman dream set a woman apart from the rest of the group. Those who had the artistic gift might become so absorbed in their art they lost the balance in their life, or those who lost control over their lives might turn to art. And in this sense, the figure gave shape to a Dakota philosophy that refused to throw away these marginal people or people who might end up on the margins, tried instead to find ways to allow them into the society. Well, Mary Sully did not leave behind a coherent statement of her thoughts and intentions, but it may be worth returning, at least speculatively, to a phrase that shows up in only a single document in which the pieces are given a formal name, the Luta personality prints. In Lakota, Luta means red, and it's not a plain everyday red, that word is Shah, but instead a bright red. Luta is often used in personal names, is associated with the act of honoring. And it may be too much in the way of conjecture to consider the relation between Luta and some of the variant words next to it in the Lakota dictionary. One of those words is luya, which suggests another meaning attached to redness, the decorating of something with red quill work, right? And honoring in this sense, and red quill work, that is to say aesthetic production, go hand in hand. This is part of the project, and it's a Dakota project. So here's one final location for Mary Sully, one that configures many aspects of her work. Her status as being possibly special in some way, her refiguring of older Dakota representational traditions, her broad and worldly visual vocabulary, her effort to understand and honor individuals through a mode that was, I think, Dakota to its core, but modernist in its practice, not even the but, take that away, portraitist in its aims, her understanding of the place of individuals within culture, as Ruth Benedict might have taught. So maybe Mary Sully saw these works in terms of luta and perhaps luya, as being read in terms of the production of decorative traditions, or read as an act of honoring and calling to attention, or read in terms of Indianness, or read as a color that appeared when she heard certain sounds or saw certain things. And I just wanted to, if anyone out there is a quilter, I'm quite proud of my mother and sister who have been on a project to sort of translate some of these images into quilt works. And so here you can see the sort of bottom panel in a quite wonderful and beautiful quilt. And so this is my own like small self-indulgence. So read in all these different ways, or perhaps even read as something to be read, right? As an artist, something to be read in the complex ways demanded by her own complicated social position. Perhaps she saw them as her own culture and personality study, an Indian reading of the national condition during the Great Depression, of the possibilities of that thing called America. She may have seen them in terms of her political heritage, which had long engaged the possibility of Sioux autonomy, perhaps even in aesthetic terms. She surely saw them in terms of the meetings of three distinct artistic realms: the aesthetic possibilities of modernist art, the commercial possibilities of modernist design, and the culturally complex, forward-looking possibilities of what I've come to call an Indian abstract. So the result is, to my mind, a body of work that belongs in our collective archive, that is to say, our collection of surviving possibilities, and in our canon, that is, the definitive texts that capture culture and meaning with such richness and economy that they become touchstones so evocative we are required to dwell upon them. And it may even belong in our historiography, that is to say, the roll call of intellectual actors who have established methodological and epistemological pathways that lead to the questions and interpretations central to the now. These personality prints, I think, shift our picture of the world, forcing us to think again about the complex lives of seemingly simple individuals like Mary Sully, the ways in which the people and the things that seem the most humble, the most marginal, can in fact open up new universes of thought and possibility. So thank you all very much, and I shall stop sharing at this point. And here we are.
Thank you so much. I think Mary Sully's work is brilliant, and so is your interpretive, methodologically complicated efforts to bring it forward. It's astonishingly rich, and I'm so impressed by the digging and the research that you've done to support the story that you're able to pull together. I wonder though, you're working with fragments, and what questions remain for you? What questions remain still pressing for you about her and her work?
You know, there are I believe, six images that I have that don't have. So almost all of these at one point either had a title card attached to them or detached but folded in with them, or a name written on the back. But there's 6 images that actually don't have any identifiers at all, and I can't make them match up to the list. So this has created kind of a mystery to me, right? The list becomes less definitive in some ways, right? And there's a new challenge to sort of imagine, you know, what these other things might be. It also seems to me to open up the possibilities that perhaps some of these things did leave her hands and go elsewhere, that there may be other things out there. There's a bit of correspondence with not very many people, but at least a couple, where she's written to some of these figures, Zazu Pitts, an actor, and said, I'm doing a personality print of you. How do you feel about that? And it's clearly a bid for, you know, some sort of patronage, which is not successful. But it does suggest, if there was a kind of campaign that's not been visible in the very small archive, that perhaps there's other instances, that maybe there's other things out there that I haven't been able to identify. There are things on the list which clearly don't match up to the 6 that are unidentified. You know, for really interesting people, J. Edgar Hoover, Marian Anderson, Igor Sikorsky, right? So it does feel to me like the archive, I've treated it as a complete thing, but one of the things that's pretty clear to me is the archive may not be as complete, you know, as I have imagined it to be.
And you just wonder, right, if she's with her sister, she's with Ella, and she's in New York, and they're with Franz Boas, and what is that social, intellectual, cultural community like? And did her work flow through that in any way? They must have known that she was a maker, right? They must have known she was an artist.
Yeah, you know, I wonder about that milieu, you know. I mean, was Ella bringing her along to a party at Ruth Benedict's house? I mean, this is, of course, a moment when Ruth Benedict is quite marginalized within the Columbia, you know, department around questions about gender and sexuality in particular. How does that impact sort of the ways in which those sisters are kind of thinking and moving, you know, across space and time? There's also, you know, one of the curious things is there's only one visual artist who shows up here. And part of the argument, I think, that she is sort of trying to work through in choosing characters and people to draw personalities is a kind of high culture argument, right? There's a lot of opera singers, there's a lot of pop culture figures as well, but, you know, there are some people who are coming out of really interesting places. But almost no visual artists. The only visual artist is a person named Annie Stein, who, as far as I can tell, was someone who went to the Art Students League and took some lessons and, you know, painted a little bit and had a show at a YMCA, you know, in New York City. And, you know, was this a patronage bid? You know, she seems to be a somewhat elite, you know, kind of figure, or was it? So there's a bit of a mystery there, you know, around why Annie Stein and why no other artists. You know, what was she thinking about art in that sort of sense as she was making art? You know, I think there's also a kind of a design world question about this. It's pretty clear that Ella saw the possibilities for, you know, turning some of these designs into cash, you know, and, you know, and there's at least some evidence in some of Ella's correspondence that perhaps she had kind of grabbed some of these and sent them off perhaps somewhere to try to imagine that these could have been, you know, kind of industrial designs. You know, so there may be some other things out there that, you know, to me, the archive came to us in a kind of fairly complete way, but I'm just not so sure that's the case.
And was this archive based on the box in your mom's basement?
Yeah. So when she died in 1963, you know, basically all this art, and there's a few other things that are part of this collection that are sort of, you know, interesting. She does this. Only 4 or 5 of these little images where she draws animals with various Indian jewelry. It's really interesting. Dogs with rings on them. You know, it's quite a curious thing. In any case, these things passed to Ella, you know, who then died in 1971. And then they passed from Ella to my grandfather, Ella had a lot of paper. My grandfather was trying to figure out what to do with this. You know, some of it went to the archives at the Dakota Indian Foundation and the University of South Dakota. The art seemed to be this kind of odd anomaly. And so basically my grandfather sent it to my mom and said, look, you know, you're a librarian, catalog this or do whatever you librarians do with it. You know, he didn't, it really, you know, apparently he was on the verge of saying like, can't make sense of this. It's just junk, and he was going to throw it away. My mom, I think, is really the hero of this story. She really recognized this for what it was. My dad was not that keen on it either. So my mom, more or less kind of just moved it out of my dad's orbit and kind of, hid it away from him a little bit. It was really actually only after my dad passed in 2005 that my mom and I kind of reopened this. But I should say, I was there when the box came, in the mid 70s, and, you couldn't pull out a computer and Google people. And we had a very hard time making sense of it. There was a few people that we recognized, but we didn't know quite what to make of it. And then there was a lot of, Alice Fazende, who was the last living Confederate widow. There was no way to, appeared in a tiny little snippet in the Saturday Evening Post in 1934. So we were puzzled by it too. We couldn't make much sense of it. When I pulled it out in 2006, however, and sat there with my laptop and started putting people's names in, all of a sudden you could see it, kind of gaining some richness. And then the more historical investigation, as I said, the deeper and richer the images themselves become. It's quite an extraordinary thing, right? To sort of look at the image and then watch the image deepen and deepen as you acquire more historical knowledge about the figure.
That's incredibly gratifying. I mean, it's gratifying to hear you take a deep look, a close look at each one of those three panels, and suddenly they come alive in this very new way, which is thrilling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the best project of my career, right? It's like everything is downhill, not because of me, but because the material is so good, right? It's so interesting.
So what's next for this material?
Well, I've been talking with some, originally I had this material and I gave a talk, and there was some art folks in there, and they're like, this is really cool, you should do more with this. And so I had this very naive vision that I could go to some of my museum curator friends and say, hey, I got this cool stuff from my crazy aunt, in the basement, and we should do a show. And they were like, no, that's not how our museums work, right? You don't just get to walk in off the street and say, let's do a show with my stuff from a box in the basement. And so they basically said, look, you write a book and convince us that this work is as cool as you think it is. We like it, okay, but give us some texture to it, right? Make it into a kind of a collection of art. So that's what I, tried to do with the book. And so now I'm back to my curator friends saying, okay, now can we do a show, right? This kind of super cool thing. So I'm in conversations with a couple of museums, and kind of nice, wonderful, lovely, big museums, and people are quite interested in it. So I'm hoping that there'll be a single artist show, of the work that will, kind of open up in the next couple of years, and we'll travel a little bit, and and that she'll really get her due. I see her as the kind of the Hilma af Klint of Indian country, basically, right? And it has
absolutely
the same feel to me, right? In that sense.
Yeah, she came immediately to mind in that comparison. Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm convinced. So
okay, great.
I'm convinced. Thank you so much, Phil. I mean, it's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. And I really appreciate you doing this for the Davis and for those of us who joined on. I noticed that there are people from all over the country. So it's really wonderful to hear you speak about this.
Well, it's my great privilege. I mean, I should say, the three of these were actually in the wonderful show Hearts of Our Peoples, right, which originated out of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts.
I saw that there.
Yeah, and it was, to me, it was just a really stunning moment. I think, that she lived a hard life, right, and she died as an artist that had never really had her work shown. And my wife and I just walked into that installation, which was full of amazing and wonderful art, and we came around the corner to this, and we just wept, just thinking about what this meant. And it's I think for Native folks, right, we live in this world where the connections between those who have gone before and those who are here now and those who are coming are a little more porous maybe than other places. I felt like we could really feel her there, and at least hoping that, I had been able to do her a little bit of justice. So.
I think you have.
Yeah.
I think you have.
So.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Good night.
Good night.